What is the Judicial Branch by Ellen Roger? The three branches. Every country needs laws. Governments make, carry out, and enforce laws. The United States federal government has three branches. They are the executive, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. They have the power to make decisions about the country. The president is the head of the executive branch. Presidents have many duties and powers. They direct the government and command the armed forces. They also approve or reject proposed laws. The legislative branch includes the House of Representatives and the Senate. Together, they form Congress. All members of Congress are elected. Congress makes laws. The president lives in the White House in Washington, D.C. The executive branch of government often meets there. The Supreme Court has been meeting in the Supreme Court building since 1935. The Supreme Court heads the judicial branch. It is the country's highest court. Supreme Court judges review laws. They decide the meaning of the Constitution. In their own words, we are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judge say it is. Charles Evan Hughes, New York Governor and 11th Supreme Court Chief Justice, 1907. The Judicial Branch. The judicial branch deals with the laws of the country. It includes the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts. The judicial branch interprets and explains laws. It decides whether people have broken laws. If they have, it also decides what their punishment should be. Laws are rules that people are supposed to follow. They protect people from being harmed by others. If people break laws, sometimes they go to jail or have to pay a fine. Without laws, a country could not run properly. Several sculptures stand outside the Supreme Court building. This figure represents or stands for justice and law. Imagine there were no laws about stealing. People could take what they wanted, and you can do nothing about it. Laws have been created by Congress to prevent theft. People are less likely to steal knowing that they can be punished. Laws are also supposed to provide justice. Justice means fairness. People need to know that their government is treating them fairly. Laws are meant to protect people. People who break laws are often punished. In their own words, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Civil Rights Leader, 1963. The Constitution. More than 200 years ago, America, still a group of colonies ruled by Great Britain. Britain passed laws that the colonists felt were unfair. The laws for America were made by a king and a government far away. The colonists revolted. They declared their independence in 1776. After gaining their independence, America had to decide what kind of government they wanted. They wrote a constitution that would protect their freedom. The U.S. Constitution set up the different branches of government. It gave each branch separate powers. One branch could not be more powerful than the other. Britain lost the Revolutionary War in 1775 to 1783. Here, a British general surrenders or gives up to an American general. The Constitution sets the rules for the government we have today. The Constitution was written more than 235 years ago. It is the oldest written constitution of any nation. It has been amended or changed many times. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton discussed the country's constitution. They were three of the founders of the United States. What do you think? If the Constitution was written 11 years after the colonists declared their independence, what year was it written in? Working together. The Constitution gives each branch of government its own duties. All branches must work together for the government to run. Congress has the power to propose laws. The president has the power to veto or reject laws passed by Congress. Congress can then override or cancel the president's veto. The Supreme Court can override the decisions of both Congress and the president. It can tell Congress that a law Congress proposed goes against the Constitution. The Supreme Court can also tell presidents that they did something not allowed by the Constitution. This system is called checks and balances. Leaders from different states decided what the new country's government would look like. The Supreme Court building has a saying on its entrance. The words say, "Equal justice under law." The court exists to treat all Americans fairly. It overturns laws that are against the Constitution. This process is called judicial review. The Constitution has been changed several times. These changes are called amendments. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, outlawed slavery. In their own words, "The happy union of these states is a wonder. Their Constitution is a miracle. Their example, the hope of liberty throughout the world." James Madison, Founding Father and 4th President, 1829. The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the country's highest court. It was created by the Constitution in 1789. It hears 70 to 100 cases each year. Most of the cases are appeals from lower courts. Appeals are requests to change the decisions of lower courts. Thousands of appeal petitions or requests are made each year. The Supreme Court decides which petitions it will hear. The Supreme Court has the final say in a court case. It is very hard to change a decision of the Supreme Court. Before the Supreme Court building was built, Supreme Court justices met in old Senate chamber in the United States Capitol. Sonia Sotomayor is Supreme Court's first Hispanic justice. She also only the fourth female justice in the court's history. Justice Sotomayor wears a black robe when in court. It is not easy to get a job on the Supreme Court. There are only 9 judges who are called justices. Supreme Court justices are nominated or chosen by the president. The Senate approves or rejects the president's choice. What do you think? Who decides which cases are heard by the Supreme Court? The Chief Justice. Imagine being the top judge of the highest court in the country. It is a difficult job with long hours. The Chief Justice is the head of the judicial branch. The job has many duties. Some of them include making sure the federal courts run properly, representing the court, swearing in presidents at the beginning of their term. I do solemnly swear Chief Justice John Roberts swore in President Barack Obama in 2009. Swearing in new presidents is just one of many jobs of the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice of the United States is one of 9 Supreme Court justices. These justices hold their jobs for life. Most leave after working about 15 years. Each justice includes the Chief Justice, has 1 vote in a decision. The first Chief Justice was John Jay. Jay was a lawyer and a founding father of the United States. By 2012, there have been 17 Chief Justices. Only 4 cases were heard during John Jay's term as Chief Justice, 1789 to 1795. In their own words, when a president chooses a Supreme Court justice, he is placing in human hands the full authority and majesty of the law. The decisions of the Supreme Court affect the life of every American. President George W. Bush, 2005. The Justices. Justices are the judges who make decisions. They are usually lawyers who know a lot about the law. All Supreme Court justices are nominated by the President and approved by Congress. The justices of the Supreme Court serve for life or until they retire or resign. They meet at the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. Their building contains a courtroom, justices' offices, and a court library. It even has a gym with a basketball court. The Supreme Court's meetings begin on the first Monday of October. A meeting of the justices is called a session. Sessions run from October until June or July. Sometimes justices sit and hear cases. At other times, the court is in recess. When in recess, the justices think about cases and write their opinions. Opinions are judgments based on their ideas about the law. The Supreme Court meets in this courtroom called a chamber. Thurgood Marshall was the first African American Supreme Court judge. In their own words, laws matter because it keeps us safe, because it protects our most fundamental rights and freedoms, and because it is the foundation of our democracy. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, 2010. The court system. The judicial branch of government and is the federal court system. The word judicial means judgment or justice. Courts hear cases and make judgments based on laws. Besides the Supreme Court, the judicial branch also includes many lower federal courts. The main ones are the district courts and the courts of appeals. Imagine the police thought you had robbed a federal bank. Your case may be heard in a district court. District courts are trial courts. A judge and a jury would decide if you were guilty or not. A jury is a small group of people chosen to hear the facts of a case. The first Supreme Court meetings were held in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. If you were found guilty, you would have the right to go to the United States Court of Appeals. Appeals are heard by 3 judges that work together on a case. You must submit a written report called a brief to the judges to show the trial court made a legal error that affected your case. If the judges agree, they can overturn or reverse the trial court's decision. The Court of Appeals usually has the final say unless you submit a request to have the U.S. Supreme Court review your case. However, the Supreme Court only chooses to review about 100 cases a year. If the Supreme Court doesn't choose your case, the decision made by the Court of Appeals is final. The United States Marshal Service is a federal police force. Marshals protect the courts and enforce federal laws. District courts. District courts are trial courts for the United States federal court system. Unlike the Supreme Court that was created by the Constitution, district court was made by Congress. The district courts deal with cases where federal laws have been broken. District courts also settle fights between people and companies. This area of the law is called civil law. Some U.S. district courts deal with special issues such as taxes. District court cases are heard in federal court buildings. The United States is divided into judicial districts. Each district has 1 or more district courts. There are 89 districts within the 50 U.S. states, with at least 1 district court in each state. Cases in district courts are heard by a judge and a jury. The district courts select U.S. citizens from the area to serve on a jury. In March 2011, Judge Kimberly J. Mueller became the first female judge in the Eastern District Court of California. What do you think? What kinds of cases are heard in a district court? Different U.S. courts. There are many kinds of law, including federal laws, state laws, and local laws. Different courts hear cases based on laws that were broken. Federal courts are part of the judicial branch. Each state sets up its own state courts to handle cases that involve state laws. Cities and counties have their own courts for local laws that are broken. Jurisdiction is what makes their courts different from each other. When a law is broken, it must first be determined whether the law is federal, state, or local law. That determines which court has the jurisdiction or power to hear and make a judgment on the case. Federal courts hear cases about federal laws. They also hear cases where a state law goes against the Constitution. Because there are more state laws than any other kind, state courts have jurisdiction in most cases. Local courts hear cases that break city or county laws. Local court officers bring a prisoner to court. If you robbed a federal bank, your case would be heard in a federal district court. If you robbed a gas station, your case would be heard in a state court. If you wrote graffiti on a wall, your case may be heard in a local court. Federal courts can put federal bank robbers in jail for many years and make them pay a fine. Trials and appeals. Trials take place in courts. In a trial, lawyers try to prove a defendant is guilty or innocent of a crime. A defendant is a person who may have done something against the law. Lawyers present evidence or information about what happened. A judge and a jury decide a case. If the defendant is found guilty, a judge decides the sentence. A sentence could mean time in prison or a fine. Sometimes district courts make mistakes and innocent people are found guilty of crimes they did not commit. If a mistake was made, the U.S. federal court system allows defendants another chance. A court reporter takes notes on a special machine during every trial. Sometimes a defendant asks for a new trial. The new court can then review these notes. Defendants who are found guilty in district courts can appeal their case. They ask for another trial in the Court of Appeals. If they lose in the Court of Appeals, they can ask the Supreme Court to review their case. The Supreme Court reviews only some of these cases. Some district courts look very different from the Supreme Court. What do you think? What happens if a mistake is made in a district court? In session. The Supreme Court meets in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court building. The justices gather in a courtroom. A court official yells, "Hear ye," which is saying as "O ye's." The court is then declared in session. The justices sit in tall black chairs and face the people in the court. The chief justices sit in the middle. Lawyers then present their cases to the court. The justices listen. Sometimes several different cases are presented in one day. At the end of the day, the Chief Justice bangs the gavel. All the justices leave the courtroom. The gavel is a symbol of a judge's power. Judges bang the gavel to start a trial or to stop people from being noisy. But that does not end their work. The justices study the case in their own chambers or offices. Then they meet in another room. Each justice has one vote. Decisions are made by the majority of votes. Supreme Court decisions are final. The judges of the Supreme Court pose for a portrait in their official robes. You and the courts. Courts make many decisions. Some only affect the people involved. Others affect everyone. Some decisions made by federal courts have changed the way we live in the United States. In 1953, the Supreme Court overturned a state law that allowed segregation. Segregation means to set apart groups of people based on the color of their skin. The law allowed separate public schools for black students and white students. The Supreme Court said separate schools was unequal according to the court. Unequal schools were against the Constitution. Separate schools and classrooms for black children was common before 1954. The case was called Brown versus Board of Education. The letter V stands for versus, meaning against. After the Supreme Court decision, white and black students started to go to the same schools. By 1968, the Supreme Court had declared that other laws that denied civil rights was also against the Constitution. Other places besides schools were also segregated. Some bus and train stations had separate waiting rooms. The Supreme Court's ruling changed the country. What do you think? How did the Brown versus Board of Education case changes schools today? Other countries' courts. Every country has its own judicial branch and court systems. Each is based on the country's form of government and its traditions. The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom is the country's highest court. It is the final appeals court. It has 10 justices plus a president and deputy president. Sometimes judges in the Supreme Court of Australia wear red robes and wigs. Canada has a Supreme Court with 9 justices appointed by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the head of government. The Supreme Court of Canada is the country's highest court. It also the final court of appeal. The Supreme Court of France is called the Court of Concession. It was established in 1790 during the French Revolution. It is the court of final appeal for civil and criminal cases. Germany's Supreme Court is similar to the United States Supreme Court. It reviews laws to see if they are unconstitutional, but it does not normally hear appeals. Germany's government selects its judges. British Supreme Court justices wear fancy robes for special events. Normally, they dress in business suits. Discussion questions. At the entrance of the Supreme Court building, the following words are found: equal justice under law. What does these words mean? How do they apply to the judicial branch? And why is it difficult to take a case to court to Supreme Court. What laws and freedoms do you feel all people should have and why?